What kind of man fakes his own death, climbs out of a coffin, and slaughters an entire city before breakfast? The year is 1040. In Sicily, a heavy wooden coffin grinds against the stone pavement of a besieged citadel. The guards of the fortress watch from the walls. They have heard the news. The commander of the Northman, the giant who has been terrorizing their island for months, is dead, killed by a sudden fever. His soldiers have asked permission to bury him inside the city walls, in consecrated ground, as befits a Christian warrior. The gates swing open. The funeral procession enters the courtyard. The priests raise their hands to bless the dead. The mourners weep. The coffin is carried toward the church. And then the lid explodes. The corpse leaps out. He is not rotting. He is roaring. He grips a battle axe in his massive hands. Before the guards can scream, the mourners throw off their cloaks and draw hidden blades. The courtyard becomes a slaughterhouse. Within the hour, the city falls. This is not a legend. This is a tactic. And the man who invented it was the most dangerous survivor of the 11th century. His name was Harald Sigurdsson. History remembers him as Harald Hardrada, the Hard Ruler, the Last Viking. If you want more stories like this, subscribe. To understand how a man becomes capable of such lethal creativity, we must go back 15 years, to a muddy valley in Norway, to a boy standing in a crumbling shield wall, watching his brother die. The year is 1030. The place is Stiklestad in central Norway. The air smells of rain and blood. A 15-year-old boy named Harald stands shoulder to shoulder with his half-brother, King Olaf Haraldsson. They are trying to reclaim the Norwegian throne from the Danish-backed rebels who have stolen it. They are losing. The shield wall is buckling. The rebels outnumber them 3-1. This is not a glorious duel of champions. This is a massacre conducted by farmers with axes. Harald watches a rebel drive a blade into his brother's leg. Another spear punches through the king's gut. Olaf falls. The royal banner wavers and drops. Harald screams. He swings his sword at the shapes pressing in around him. But he is a boy fighting giants. A blade slashes across his neck. Another strikes his body. The world spins. He hits the mud. Bodies fall on top of him. The weight of the dead pins him down. He should have died there. The battle ended. The rebels won. The corpse strippers moved through the field, taking weapons and jewelry from the fallen. Harald lay beneath a pile of bodies, bleeding, barely breathing. When night fell, he crawled out. A local farmer found him in the darkness. The farmer dragged the broken prince to a remote farmhouse and hid him in a cellar. For weeks, Harald lay there while his wounds slowly healed. His body knitted itself back together. His mind hardened into something new. The boy who walked onto the field at Stiklestad died that day. The man who crawled out of the mud was a different creature entirely. A survivor, a fugitive, a wolf with nothing left to lose. He could not stay in Norway. The new rulers had put a price on his head. Harald gathered a handful of survivors from the battle and fled into the mountains. They crossed the frozen mountain range that separates Norway from Sweden. They moved like ghosts through the snow, surviving on tree bark and whatever game they could catch. They emerged on the other side, exhausted and half-starved, and kept moving east. Their destination was Kiev, the capital of the Rus, a city ruled by Grand Prince Yaroslav the Wise. Yaroslav had married Harald's niece years earlier. There was a family connection, however thin. Harald presented himself at the prince's court. He had no crown, no army, no land. All he had was a scarred neck, a sword, and a reputation for being impossible to kill. He offered his blade to the highest bidder. The exiled prince was gone. The mercenary had arrived. Kiev in the 1030s was not a refuge, it was a forge. Yaroslav the Wise was locked in constant warfare. Poles pressed from the west. Nomadic tribes raided from the south. The Pechenegs, fierce horse archers from the steppes, were a constant threat. For a young Viking with nothing to lose, business was booming. Harald took his small band and integrated them into Yaroslav's army. Here, on the edge of the steppes, he learned a new kind of war. In Norway, battles were static collisions of shield walls, two lines of men grinding against each other until one broke. But the Rus fought differently. They faced enemies who would not stand still. The Pechenegs were horse archers who struck like smoke and vanished before a counterattack could form. Harald was forced to adapt. He learned to coordinate mixed units. He learned to use terrain. He learned to predict the unpredictable. He rose quickly through the ranks. Within 3 years, he was a captain. He burned towns. He suppressed revolts. He secured borders. He became a favorite of Yaroslav. But favor is not the same as status. Harald made the mistake of falling in love. Yaroslav had a daughter named Elisiv. She was beautiful, educated, and completely out of Harald's reach. He asked for her hand in marriage. Yaroslav refused. Harald was a king without a kingdom, a prince without a penny. He had blood on his hands, but no gold in his pockets. He was a mercenary, not a monarch. The rejection stung, but it also gave Harald a purpose. If the world demanded gold, he would get it. He looked south. Stories drifted up the river trade routes about a city of unimaginable riches, a place the Northmen called Miklagard, the Great City, Constantinople, the capital of the Byzantine Empire. They said the emperor paid his guards in silk and silver. They said that a man could make his fortune there if he was willing to kill for it. Harald gathered his men. There were about 500 of them now. They prepared for the journey south, down the Dnieper River, to the richest city on earth. The route was called the way from the Varangians to the Greeks. It was one of the most dangerous trade routes in the world. The Dnieper was broken by a series of 7 catastrophic cataracts, massive rapids where jagged rocks tore the hulls out of ships. To pass them, the Vikings had to beach their long ships and drag the vessels overland on wooden rollers. It took days, and it left them completely exposed. The Pechenegs knew exactly where these portages were. They waited in the tall grass. When the Vikings were hauling their heavy oak ships through the mud, the arrows began to fly. Harald did not panic. He organized a defensive perimeter around the grounded ships. The shield wall locked tight. They fought back to back, heavy infantry against swirling light cavalry. They survived the first rapid, then the second, then the third. By the time they cleared the 7th cataract, the river behind them was choked with bodies. They had run the gauntlet. The survivors reloaded the ships and sailed into the open waters of the Black Sea. As the coastline of Thrace came into view, the horizon changed. Rising out of the mist were walls, triple-layered, towering stone fortifications that stretched from sea to sea. Behind them, domes of gold glittered under the Mediterranean sun. This was Miklagard, Constantinople, the center of the world. Harald stood at the prow of his ship. He was 20 years old. He had survived the massacre at Stiklestad, the frozen forests of Sweden, the wars of Poland, and the ambushes of the Dnieper. He looked at the richest city on earth. He did not see a sanctuary. He saw a bank vault waiting to be cracked. He marched straight to the recruitment offices of the Varangian Guard. He did not join as a common soldier. He arrived with 500 battle-hardened veterans. The Byzantines welcomed him with open arms. The Varangian Guard was the emperor's personal military force. Popular history often paints them as elite bodyguards, standing stoically in throne rooms. The reality was uglier. They were the emperor's problem solvers. When a province rebelled, when pirates choked the trade routes, when the mob threatened the palace, the emperor unleashed the Northmen. They were his blunt instrument. Harald fit this role perfectly. His first major assignment was hunting Saracen corsairs. Arab pirates were plaguing the Greek islands. The Byzantines sent Harald and his men to clean them out. The clash was visceral. The Saracens wielded curved scimitars and light armor. Harald's men were tanks. They formed a shield wall on the heaving decks, an impenetrable line of wood and iron. The Arabs crashed against it and broke. Then the axes came down. The Varangians wielded the two-handed Dane axe. Against light leather armor, the effect was catastrophic. Limbs were severed, shields were splintered. Harald led from the front. The Byzantine chroniclers describe him as a thunderbolt. He did not just defeat the pirates, he annihilated them. He chased the survivors back to their coastal strongholds and burned them out. But the most important part of these campaigns was not the killing, it was the looting. Byzantine custom allowed the commander to keep a substantial portion of the spoils. Harald took this literally. Every pirate ship captured, every town sacked, he skimmed the cream off the top. And unlike his peers, who spent their money on wine and women, Harald was banking it. He set up a secret supply line back to Kiev. Chests heavy with silver and gold were shipped north to Prince Yaroslav. Harald was turning the violence of the Mediterranean into a retirement fund. He was arguably the first Viking venture capitalist. By 1038, his reputation was soaring. The Byzantine chroniclers began to write about him. They called him Araltes. They described him with a mixture of awe and disgust. The emperor promoted him and sent him to Sicily. The Byzantine Empire was trying to reclaim the island from the Saracens. Harald and the Varangians fought across the island for 3 years. They faced fortified cities, determined defenders, and the grinding logistics of siege warfare. This is where Harald invented his most famous trick. One city refused to fall. The walls were too high. The defenders were too stubborn. A direct assault would cost too many men. So Harald tried something different. He spread a rumor through his camp. The commander of the Northmen was sick. The fever had taken him. He was dying. Days passed. Then came the announcement. Harald Sigurdsson was dead. His men approached the city walls under a flag of truce. They said they only wanted to bury their leader inside the walls, in consecrated ground. The defenders, relieved that the monster was finally gone, agreed. The gates opened. The funeral procession entered. The coffin was carried toward the church. And then Harald exploded out of the box. The mourners threw off their cloaks and drew hidden weapons. The courtyard became a slaughterhouse. Within the hour, the city was in Viking hands. It was cold. It was ruthless. It was brilliant. From Sicily, Harald was sent to Bulgaria. From Bulgaria, he was sent to the Holy Land. The Byzantines kept him busy for nearly a decade, fighting their wars across 3 continents. He saw Jerusalem. He fought in Asia Minor. And through it all, he kept sending money north. By 1042, Harald had spent nearly 10 years fighting for the empire. He had become one of the most powerful men in Constantinople. He was rich beyond imagination. He was feared throughout the Mediterranean. And then he made enemies. The Emperor Michael IV died, and his nephew Michael V took the throne. The new emperor was paranoid. He saw the giant Norwegian not as an asset, but as a threat. Harald knew too much. He had too many soldiers loyal to him personally. Michael V accused Harald of embezzling imperial funds, which, to be fair, Harald had definitely been doing. He threw the Varangian commander into a dungeon. But Harald walked out of prison into a revolution. The citizens of Constantinople had risen up against Michael V. The emperor had made the mistake of exiling the popular Empress Zoe. The mob was tearing the city apart, demanding the emperor's head. Harald did not flee. He saw an opportunity. He aligned himself with Empress Zoe's faction, and Zoe had a very specific job for her favorite bulldog. The mob dragged Emperor Michael V from his sanctuary in a monastery. They hauled him into the streets, screaming for justice. In Byzantine tradition, a man could not be emperor if he was physically imperfect. Harald stepped forward. He held the terrified emperor down, and then, according to the Norse sagas, he took a blade and gouged out Michael's eyes. Some accounts say he used his thumbs. It was a brutal, personal act of violence that cemented his legend. Harald was not just a soldier anymore. He was a kingmaker and a kingbreaker. He had blinded a Roman Caesar with his own hands. But the gratitude of politicians is short-lived. Empress Zoe denied him permission to leave Constantinople. She wanted to keep her pet dangerous, but leashed. Harald was done with leashes. He gathered his men and his loot. Years of plunder hidden away in secret caches. They seized 2 galleys in the harbor under cover of night. But there was a problem. The Golden Horn, the great harbor of Constantinople, was sealed. A gigantic iron chain stretched across the water, blocking the exit. The chain was designed to stop fleets. No ship could pass. Harald looked at the chain. He looked at his ships. He did not turn back. He ordered his men to row. As they approached the chain, he commanded everyone not rowing to grab their heavy sea chests and run to the back of the boat. The weight shifted. The prow of the galley lifted high out of the water, angling upward like a ramp. Harald steered straight at the chain. The keel slammed onto the iron links. Wood screeched against metal. The ship hung there, balanced precariously. "Forward!" Harald screamed. The men sprinted from the back of the ship to the front. The center of gravity shifted violently. The galley tipped forward, sliding off the chain and plunging into the open water on the other side. The second ship was not so lucky. It caught on the chain and broke its back. Men and gold sank into the dark water. But Harald was through. He raised his sail and caught the wind. He left behind the blinded emperor, the scheming empress, and the ruins of his prison. He sailed north toward Kiev. The mercenary was dead. The king was coming home. Harald arrived in Kiev as a legend. He was no longer the ragged fugitive who had fled through the snow 15 years earlier. He was the most famous Viking in the world. He was also obscenely wealthy. The sagas say the amount of gold Harald brought back was staggering. No man in the north had ever seen such riches in one place, literal tons of silver and gold. And now, finally, he claimed his prize. He married Elisiv, Yaroslav's daughter. The woman he had been denied as a penniless exile was now his wife. But the wedding was just a formality. The real target was Norway. The Norwegian throne was held by his nephew, Magnus Olafsson. Magnus was young, charismatic, and the illegitimate son of Harald's martyred brother, Saint Olaf. He had united Norway and Denmark under his rule. But his treasury was empty. Wars are expensive. Magnus was land-rich and cash-poor. Harald assessed the board. He had the best soldiers in the world, and enough gold to hire every mercenary in the Baltic. He could invade. But that would destroy the very prize he wanted to win. So he made an offer. He invited Magnus to a parley on the deck of his flagship. On one side stood Magnus, young, beloved by his people, but broke. On the other stood Harald, scarred, terrifying, backed by a mountain of gold. Harald proposed a deal. He would share his immense wealth with Magnus. In exchange, Magnus would share the throne. They would rule as co-kings. Magnus looked at the gold. He looked at his unpaid army. He agreed. It was a bloodless coup. Harald literally bought half of Norway. For 2 years, the uncle and nephew ruled together. It was an uneasy alliance. Magnus was the good, generous, open-handed, loved by his people. Harald was the hard, stern, demanding, feared by everyone. But in 1047, the problem solved itself. Magnus died. Some sources say a riding accident. Others say a sudden illness. Given Harald's track record and his knowledge of Byzantine poisons, modern historians raise an eyebrow, but there is no proof. On his deathbed, Magnus gave Denmark to his rival, Sweyn Estridsson. He gave Norway to Harald. Harald Hardrada stood alone. He was the undisputed king of Norway. But the transition was jarring. The Norwegians were used to the gentle rule of Magnus. They were not ready for the management style of a man who had spent 10 years enforcing the will of Byzantine tyrants. Harald looked at his new kingdom and saw disorder. He saw chieftains who thought they were independent. He saw tax evaders. He saw a population that needed to be brought to heel. The time for buying loyalty was over. The time for breaking it had begun. Hardrada. Historians translate it politely as the stern counselor or the hard ruler. But if you lived in Norway in 1050, you knew what it really meant. It meant tyrant. Harald brought the autocracy of Constantinople to the fjords of Scandinavia. He did not want consensus. He wanted obedience. He ruled by fear, not by love. For nearly 20 years, he turned the waters between Norway and Denmark into a war zone. He launched raids to inflict misery. Every summer, his fleet descended on the Danish coast. They burned crops, slaughtered livestock, and dragged the young away to sell in slave markets. The goal was simple: make life so unbearable that they would beg for Harald. But the real threat was not abroad, it was at home. The Norwegian nobility began to grumble. The voice of this opposition was a man named Einar Thambarskelfir, an old, powerful chieftain who had fought alongside Harald's brother. He dared to stand up and criticize Harald's constant warring. To Harald, Einar was not just a critic, he was an obstacle. And Harald had learned in the dungeons of Constantinople how to deal with obstacles. He invited Einar and his son to a reconciliation meeting at his royal farm. It looked like a diplomatic summit. It was actually an assassination. As Einar walked into the king's hall, he sensed the trap. The chronicles record his final words. "There is a smell of treachery here." The doors slammed shut. Harald's men emerged from the shadows. There was no trial, no debate. Einar and his son were hacked to death in the guest hall. The assassination sent a shockwave through Norway, but it worked. The opposition was decapitated. The remaining chieftains understood. You do not argue with Harald Sigurdsson. To secure his grip, Harald founded a new settlement at the head of a deep fjord, a place easy to defend and perfect for launching ships. He called it Oslo. Today, to a lesser man, this would have been a defeat. To Harald, it was simply a clearing of the schedule. He was 50 years old. His hair was gray. Most Vikings his age were dead or retired, but Harald was restless. The peace left him with a massive, idle army and a thirst for one last great conquest. He needed a new war. And then, across the North Sea, fate delivered one. In January of 1066, King Edward the Confessor of England died childless. With his last breath, he triggered a succession crisis that would shatter the medieval world. The English council immediately crowned Harold Godwinson. But across the English Channel, William of Normandy was already building an invasion fleet. But far to the north, a third player entered the game. Enter Tostig Godwinson. Tostig was the brother of the new English king, and he hated him with a biblical intensity. Tostig had been Earl of Northumbria until the locals rebelled against his brutal rule. His own brother had stripped him of his title and exiled him. He was desperate, bitter, and looking for a weapon to destroy his sibling. He found that weapon in Norway. Tostig sailed to Oslo to meet Harald Hardrada. The conversation that followed changed history. Tostig played on Harald's vanity. He told the old warrior that England was divided, that the people despised Harold Godwinson, and that the English army was weak. He whispered the dream of the North Sea Empire. Harald listened. He was 50 years old. His joints ached from decades of sleeping on ship decks. He should have been looking for a successor, not a war. But the last Viking could not resist the siren song of one final, glorious conquest. He dug up a flimsy legal pretext, an old treaty that said, "If you die without heirs, I get your kingdom." It was laughably thin, but for Harald, it was enough. He initiated total mobilization. 300 longships gathered, 15,000 men. It was the largest Viking force ever assembled for a single campaign. But as the fleet gathered, the mood was heavy. The sagas report that the soldiers were plagued by nightmares. One man dreamed of a giant troll woman riding a wolf, tossing the bodies of Viking warriors into its gaping mouth. The message from the spirit world was clear. You are sailing to your graves. Harald ignored the omens. He left his son Magnus behind to rule Norway, but he took his wife Elisiv, his daughters, and his younger son Olaf. This signaled his intent. He was not planning to raid England and leave. He was planning to live there. In September of 1066, the winds turned favorable. The sails were hoisted. 300 prows cut through the North Sea. The last great Viking invasion had begun. The invasion began perfectly. The Viking fleet sailed up the River Ouse, anchoring at Recall. The Earls of Northern England, Edwin and Morcar, were young and inexperienced. Instead of waiting behind the walls of York, they decided to march out and fight the most experienced general in the world in an open field. It was a catastrophic mistake. On September 20th, 1066, the two armies collided at the Battle of Fulford. Harold maneuvered his best troops to pin the English against a marsh. The English shield wall crumbled. The retreat became a rout. The sagas say the ditch was so filled with English bodies that the Vikings could walk across them without getting their feet wet. York, the capital of the north, surrendered immediately. But here, Harold made a decision that baffles the modern mind. He did not occupy the city. He wanted to rule England, not sack it. So he agreed to a peaceful exchange. The city would give him hostages. In return, he would not let his warriors inside the walls. They agreed to meet for the exchange at a crossroads a few miles east, a place called Stamford Bridge. Monday, September 25th, 1066. It was a beautiful day, freakishly hot for late September. The sun blazed down from a cloudless sky. Harold looked at the weather and made the call that would seal his fate. Leave the mail shirts. The heavy chainmail, weighing 30 pounds each, were left on the ships at Recall, miles away. The Viking army marched to Stamford Bridge feeling like tourists. They carried shields and weapons, but their bodies were covered only by tunics. They were relaxed. They were laughing. They believed the war was already over. The English king was supposed to be weeks away on the southern coast, watching for the Norman invasion. As they lounged by the river Derwent, waiting for the hostages, They saw a cloud of dust rising on the western horizon. Then came the glint of sun on steel. "Is that the hostages?" someone asked. Tostig squinted. The cloud grew larger. Underneath the dust, a forest of spears appeared. Then the banners, the golden dragon of Wessex. Harald Hardrada had been outplayed. King Harald Godwinson had done the impossible. He had marched his army nearly 200 miles in 4 days. He had not come to negotiate. He had brought the entire English army, fully armored, fully rested, furious. The Vikings were split in two by the river. They were unarmored, they were outnumbered, and they were completely surprised. Harald turned to Tostig. There was a moment of decision. "We could retreat to the ships," Tostig suggested. Harald looked at the English army thundering toward them. He looked at his men. The hard ruler did not run. He planted his banner in the ground. He sent 3 fast riders back to the ships to call for reinforcements, knowing they would never arrive in time. Then he formed a circle. The Battle of Stamford Bridge, the end of the Viking Age, was about to begin. The English army crashed into the Viking vanguard on the west bank of the river. It was a slaughter. The Vikings, unarmored and unprepared, were pushed back toward the water. The survivors scrambled across the narrow wooden bridge to join the main force, but the English pursuit was halted by a single man. This is recorded in the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle, written by the enemies who fought him. A lone Viking warrior, a giant of a man, planted himself in the middle of Stamford Bridge. He wielded a massive Dane axe. For perhaps an hour, this anonymous berserker held back the entire English army. He killed 40 men. Arrows bounced off his shield. Spears were chopped in half. The English could not get past him. Finally, an English soldier floated down the river in a half-barrel. He maneuvered under the bridge and thrust a long spear up through the wooden planks. The spear pierced the Viking's groin. The giant fell. The bridge was open. As the English poured across, there was a pause. A rider emerged from the English lines. It was King Harald Godwinson himself. He rode up to his brother Tostig. He offered peace. He offered to return Tostig's earldom and a third of the kingdom. Reconciliation. Brotherhood restored. Tostig considered it. Then he asked the obvious question. "And what will you give to my ally, King Harald of Norway?" The rider looked at the giant Norwegian standing nearby. 7 feet of ground, he said. Or perhaps a little more, seeing as he is taller than other men. The negotiation was over. Harald Hardrada was 50 years old. He had no chainmail. He knew he was probably going to die. But he had been dying his whole life, since Stiklestad, since the cellars of Norway, since the ambushes on the Dnieper, since the dungeons of Constantinople. He ordered the war arrow to be shot, the signal for battle. The sagas say he entered the state known as Berserkergang, a battle trance. He charged. Without armor, he was faster, lighter. He wielded his sword with 2 hands, hacking through the English lines. For a moment, it looked like he might actually win. The English line buckled under the sheer ferocity of his assault. But this was not a saga. This was reality. And in reality, unarmored flesh cannot withstand missile fire. At the height of the charge, a stray arrow hissed through the air. It was not a noble duel that killed him. It was random chance. The arrow struck Harald squarely in the throat. The King of Norway stopped. The thunderbolt of the north fell to his knees. He choked on his own blood, gasping for air that would not come. He collapsed onto the 7 feet of English ground he had been promised. The fighting stopped for a heartbeat. Tostig rushed to the fallen king. The English offered surrender again, but the Vikings, seeing their leader dead, did not surrender. They screamed a war cry and charged. They chose to die around their king rather than live as prisoners. It was the twilight of the gods, played out in a muddy field in Yorkshire. The killing did not stop with Harald's death. It accelerated. The Viking reinforcements from the ships finally arrived. Miles too late and exhausted from running in the heat. They threw themselves into the fray in a suicidal frenzy. They fought until they were literally too tired to lift their axes. By sunset, Tostig Godwinson was dead. The field was silent. The aftermath was grim. Of the 300 magnificent longships that had sailed from Norway with dreams of empire, only 24 were needed to carry the survivors home. It was a demographic catastrophe. A generation of Norwegian men lay rotting in English mud. So many died that 70 years later, chroniclers wrote that the ground at Stamford Bridge was still white with bleaching bones. King Harald Godwinson had won a miraculous victory, but history is cruel. While Godwinson was celebrating in York, the wind changed. 3 days after the battle, William of Normandy landed on the undefended southern coast of England. Harald Godwinson was forced to march his battered, exhausted army all the way back south. He met William at Hastings 3 weeks later. His men were tired. His best housecarls were dead in Yorkshire. He lost. Here lies the true legacy of Harald Hardrada. He did not conquer England, but he was the reason England was conquered. He was the hammer that softened the English steel, so the Norman anvil could break it. Without Stamford Bridge, there is no Hastings. Without Hastings, the English language, culture, and history as we know them do not exist. So why does this story matter? Because Harald Hardrada was an anachronism, a man born too late. He tried to force the world to be what it used to be. He tried to live by the old code of blood and iron in a world that was moving toward feudalism and written laws. He was the ultimate adventurer, a teenage exile, a Russian mercenary, a Byzantine guardsman, a Norwegian king. He chased the horizon until the horizon finally caught him. With his death, the Viking Age effectively ended. There were raids after 1066, but the era of the Sea Kings, of massive fleets carving out empires, died with Harold on that field in Yorkshire. The north turned inward. Scandinavia became a land of Christian kingdoms, tides, and bureaucracy. The wild, expansionist energy that had terrorized Europe for 3 centuries was finally spent. Harold's body was eventually returned to Norway. He was buried in Trondheim. His final resting place has been lost to time. A fitting end for a wanderer. You have watched empires rise and fall. You have seen people refuse to accept the world as it is and fight to make it what it was. Have you seen this pattern? Someone clinging to the old ways as the world moves on? Leave a comment if a name comes to mind. And if you want more stories about the death of ages, subscribe, one every week. But his name survives. The sagas remember him. The chroniclers recorded his deeds. And the battlefield at Stamford Bridge, now a quiet village in Yorkshire, still marks the spot where the last Viking fell. In the end, he got exactly what he promised his enemies, 7 feet of ground. But in those 7 feet, he buried an entire age. And every September, the wheat grows tall in the fields of Stamford Bridge. The river flows quietly past the site of the old wooden span. The bones have long since dissolved into the English soil. But if you stand there on a warm autumn day, when the sun blazes down from a cloudless sky, you can almost hear it, the thunder of hooves, the clash of steel, and the roar of a giant who refused to kneel.